The GTP championship leaders have a nightmare race. And as a result, we see a new car enter the championship picture with just 2 races remaining. Meanwhile, there was a record crowd there at Road America to witness all the drama. Round 8 of the Imsa schedule saw the championship visit Road America. And let me tell you, things were a little bit wild right from the word go, as we saw a ton of red flags in practice. Among the cars that were involved in incidents were Jamey, who's put his number 6 Porsche 963 into the wall, resulting in front nose damage. The number 92 Kelly Moss Porsche, driven by David Brule, he put that into the barriers at turn 3. Gato Vandergaard also put his number 35 TDS Racing entry into the wall very hard, and that was in the carousel corner. And Misha Goiberg in the number 78 Lamborghini, well, he totaled his car going through the kink. Oh, and things certainly did not slow down as they went into free practice 2 either. The other TDS Racing LMP2 crashed with Stephen Thomas behind the wheel in an eerily similar incident in the carousel. Mike Skeen in the 32 Korthoff Motorsports Mercedes crashed in the kink. And there were a couple of other incidents that went on throughout the day that amounted to 8 total red flags between the 2 sessions. Now the number 11 and number 78 entries, they unfortunately had to resort to backup cars, which they were able to prepare in time for qualifying on Saturday. Now drivers would comment on the crashes, and really blame was pushed towards the lack of grip that there was off the racing line. And you'll recall that the track was just recently repaved at the end of last season, and despite IndyCar, NASCAR, and some other racing series having taken to the track, there just hasn't been enough grip that's really developed off the main racing line yet. Now that lack of grip would be a talking point throughout the weekend, but at least things would clear up as we headed into qualifying. During qualifying, Pipo Derani would put the number 31 Action Express Racing Cadillac on pole. He did that with a lap of 147.730 seconds, beating out the number 7 Porsche driven by Matt Campbell. It was an extremely close margin there, 0.07 of a second. George Kurtz captured the LMP2 pole by just over a half second. And despite getting airborne in the qualifying session, Nico Pino would put his number 33 LMP3 entry on pole by almost a second. Alex Riberas continued Heart of Racing's hot streak in GTD Pro by putting them on pole position once again. He beat out the number 79 WeatherTech Racing Mercedes by just about 0.06 of a second. And Madison Snow put the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW on pole in GTD. He beat out the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren by just around a 10th. Now going back to the tricky track conditions that we were discussing a second ago, those didn't just go away when qualifying was over, as actually in the morning warm-up for the race on Sunday morning, the number 31 Action Express Racing entry, driven at the time by Alexander Sims, this is the pole-sitting car, they crashed in morning warm-up, sustaining some rear end damage that would cause the team to have to repair the car. The crew did a great job, and the number 31 was able to start the race from the back of the GTP grid. Now, it's not very often that you hear about a pre-race incident that takes place, but there was actually a second one that happened, and this was in the warm-up laps for the race, not the morning warm-up session, but minutes before we were set to go green. The number 25 BMW would go off and get stuck in the gravel. Now this would force the race to start under a yellow flag condition, but just after one lap of some additional cleanup that they had to do, they were able to start the race as normal. But that green flag condition would not last long. And in case you're noticing a theme here, yet another wreck would take place. It was once again for that number 25 BMW. They went off in the kink on the opening lap and sustained significant damage to that car. It was reported that the off that they had into the gravel apparently upset the balance of the car. This was not known by the driver, and then when they went through the kink, there wasn't really much that they could do. Now, the number 25, they went into this race as second in the GTP standings. They would work hard on this car all race long to be able to get it back out on track. Ultimately, they did return to the track late in the race. They ran a few laps and ultimately retired the car. And let's just say, It wasn't a great day overall for the BMW M Team RLL crew, as the number 24 car would have problems as well. The number 24 suffered an electrical issue towards the second half of the race, and ultimately they had to retire that car as well. We'll talk about how these incidents affect the championship standings in a little bit. Back to the racing though, and this may shock you, but we actually ran the rest of this race caution-free. Yes, believe it or not, after the countless yellows in practice, the pre-race accidents, we actually ran this race without caution. Now this would cause some interesting strategy as well as some interesting battles to unfold. GTP would see the number 7 Porsche Penske Motorsports Porsche, driven by Matt Campbell, jump out to an early lead. However, there were some good GTP battles going on behind them. And the biggest mover of the GTP class in this opening stint was the number 5 JDC Miller Motorsports Porsche, driven by Mike Rockenfeller. Now they started the race in 9th and battled their way up, in some cases physically battled, like in this battle with the number 24 BMW, up to the 5th spot where they would eventually go on to finish the race. One of the positions that the number 5 was able to pick up was against their sistery factory Porsche entry, the number 6. Number 6 unfortunately suffered a flat tire, and they had to limp that car around a majority of the 4-mile Road America track. Meanwhile, the battle for second place, which had been kind of going on over the entirety of the first stint, was starting to come to a head. You see, after the first round of pit stops, the 0-1 swapped drivers, some from Sebastian Bourdais to Renger van de Zander. Meanwhile, when the number 60 Meyershank Racing Acura made a pit stop, they swapped out Colin Braun for Tom Blomqvist. Tom Blomqvist got in that car and was absolutely flying. He made pretty quick work of the 0-1, getting by in a good handful of laps, and then slowly started cutting into the 10-second lead that the number 7 had developed. Meanwhile, the 0-1 would kind of go in the opposite direction. They were heading backwards. They would ultimately lose another spot shortly after to the number 10 Wayne Taylor Racing Acura. But the battle between the number 7 Porsche, who was now driven by Felipe Nasr, and the number 60 Meyershank Racing Acura, that was the talking point heading into the closing laps of the race. Blomqvist was able to navigate traffic brilliantly and cut that lead down to as little as 1.7 seconds as the laps ticked down. However, that was as close as he could get. I don't know if Nasr was holding something in the tank just for the end, but Nasr put the hammer down, was able to build out just a bit of a lead towards the end, and the number 7 would be able to cross the line first. When they crossed the line, it was their first win of the season for Matt Campbell and Felipe Nasr. They dominated in this one, leading every lap but one en route to this victory. LMP2 was not quite as dominant, but it was still a very strong victory for the number 52 PR1 Matheson Motorsports entry. Of course, that was driven by Ben Keating and Paul-Loup Chatin. They led 63 of 77 laps to beat out the number 35 and number 11 TDS Racing entries. Should call them out as well. Very impressive, the runs that those two cars had after both having those incidents in Friday practice. In LMP3, well, we did see some incidents. We saw a few spins, and we also saw an incident responsibility penalty for the number 30, who spun the number 85 LMP3 around. And Tony's Kazmits sure didn't have a race to remember either. Luckily though, none of these led to any full course yellows. But despite leading only the final 13 laps of the race, the number 74 Riley Ligier, driven by Gar Robinson and Josh Burden, came out on top with their 4th victory in a row. They've been on an absolutely dominant stretch here. We'll talk about what that means for the championship in a second, but they beat out the number 33, the pole-sitting Sean Creech Motorsport entry, and the number 13 AWA Duquesne would ride an alternate strategy, pitting very, very early in this race to a podium finish. In GTD Pro, it wasn't as dominant necessarily as they were at Lime Rock, although I suppose that's pretty hard to top, but it was the number 23 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, driven by Ross Gunn and Alex Riberas, that finished on the top step of the podium yet again. This came after a great battle with the number 3 Corvette that was shaping up to really be a battle down to the finish. Unfortunately though, on their final pit stop, the number 3 Corvette picked up a penalty for failing to meet the minimum refueling time, which led to them taking a drive-through penalty. As a result of this, the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus, on a day where they didn't necessarily have the most speed, they were just super consistent and they picked up the second place on the podium. Corvette would still manage to salvage a podium though, with a third place finish. GTD witnessed another dominant outing from the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW of Madison Snow and Brian Sellers. They led 63 of 72 laps en route to victory, and along the way there were some pretty solid battles here with the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see the 70 and the 1 necessarily duke it out very much, although Frank Schandorf made a very valiant effort to try and do that in the closing laps of the race, closing the gap to the Paul Miller Racing BMW significantly. But the 70 did have some great battles with the number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, as well as the number 93 Racers Edge Acura. Unfortunately though, both of them needed to pit towards the end of this one for a splash of fuel, and they would finish a bit further down the order. As a result, the Inception Racing McLaren, driven at the time by Frank Schandorf, would bring the car home in second place. And the 32 Team Korthoff Mercedes would round out the podium in third. Now, we talked about the number 27 just a second ago. Critically for them, they came into this race second place in the GTD Championship, and realistically the only option to catch the number 1, as we're getting pretty late in the season, well, the number 27 would go on to finish 7th. We'll talk about the repercussions of that in the championship in just a minute. A couple of quick notes from the weekend though. This race at Road America broke an all-time attendance record for the track. Official numbers were not released, but Imsa did release that it was the best attendance for the race since 1979. As well, I mentioned in the preview episode that there was a new GTP car on the grid, the number 59 Proton Competition Porsche 963. Well, they were able to complete all laps, finish on the lead lap, and they brought it home 8th in class. There were also a number of IMSA support series present. In Lamborghini Super Trofeo, the duo of Danny Formal and Kyle Marcelli, well, they've set a series record with their 6th consecutive win in a row as they swept both of the races this weekend. Mazda Idemitsu MX-5 Cup defending champion Jared Thomas took over the championship points lead after he finished 2nd in race 1 and won the 2nd race. Gresham Wagner would kind of do the reverse of that. He finished 1st in race 1 and 2nd in race 2. And in Michelin Pilot Challenge, it was Windward Racing in the GS class that crossed the finish line first on a brilliant fuel strategy and fuel save from driver Daniel Morad. However, they would have the win taken away in post-race tech after it was found that they exceeded their fuel capacity and they were ultimately moved to the back of the class. This would give the win to fellow fuel save master Robin Liddell and Frank Depew. Tim Lewis and Roy Block would take the TCR win, and this came after a ton of cars had to make late race pit stops in that class for fuel, with some even running out before the end of the race. And taking a quick peek at the point standings for the Michelin Pilot Challenge, it's the number 72 Murillo Racing Mercedes that leads in the GS class, and the number 33 Brian Herta Autosports Hyundai leads in TCR. In the WeatherTech Championship standing points in GTP, it's number 10 Wayne Taylor Racing Acura. They take over the points lead with 2,171 points. That's 14 points ahead of the number 31 Action Express Racing Cadillac. They didn't have a great race, but I guess a good rebound considering what that accident and warm-up could have done for them. The number 25 BMW M Team RLL entry, they dropped to 3rd in the standings, 73 points off the lead. In LMP2, it's not as close as it was coming into this race, as the number 52 PR1 Matheson Motorsports entry takes a championship lead there. They have 1,345 points, 45 points ahead of the number 11 TDS Racing entry. In LMP3, it's the number 74 Riley Motorsports Ligier that leads with 1,495 points. They are 251 points ahead of the 2nd place number 13 AWA Duquesne. It's looking very likely that they're virtually going to have to just start the last 2 races of the season in order to lock up the championship. In GTD Pro, it's the number 14 Vassar Sullivan Lexus that leads with 2,810 points. That's 169 points ahead of the number 3 Corvette Racing entry. And in GTD, it's the number 1 Paul Miller Racing BMW that leads with 2,611 points. That is a 205 point gap over the number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin. That 7th place finish and the Paul Miller Racing win today. Man, oh man, that championship is getting very close to being locked up. There were also some great driver performances today. In GTP, I want to call out Matt Campbell, who ran a brilliant opening stint. We talked about how he put about a 10-second gap on P2 in that opening stint. And really, it was this breathing room that allowed Felipe Nasr to get in the car, just safely navigated around for the second half of the race, and hold on for the win. In LMP2, Luis Delatraz, he was tasked with driving the number 8 Tower Motorsports entry from essentially the back of the LMP2 class. He got it all the way up to 4th, a great drive for them. And in LMP3, I gotta call out Nico Pino. He started on pole, put in a brilliant first stint, and then Josh Burden, the second stint of the race for that number 74, he really did a great job to get past the number 33 entry en route to victory. In GTD Pro, I don't know how you can't call out Ross Gunn in this situation. He's been absolutely brilliant the past couple of rounds out, dating back to Lime Rock. You also got to give a shout out to Alex Riberas, his teammate. They've done a brilliant job in that car to pick up a back-to-back poles and back-to-back victories. And in GTD, bronze-rated driver Brandon Aribe had an absolutely brilliant opening stint. This came after a great qualifying effort by him to put that number 70 Inception Racing McLaren into contention for his teammate Frank Shandorf. Now, in addition to the racing action that we saw this weekend at Road America, Imsa also released the schedule for the 2024 season. Check out all the additions, all the subtractions, and everything that you need to know right here. A huge shout out to all the early Patreon supporters. If you too want to support the show, then you can head to patreon.com/offintheesses. Once again though, thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend. It doesn't go off in the S's.